All right, Alan cannot make it. Okay. He's explaining to me why. Probably in his absence, I suppose we can go um, around the room and just see what everybody's been working on. He says, "I'm sorry, it's been 11 plus hours days this week."
Oof.
That's understandable. I'll tell
Yeah.
him it's okay.
I've had some of those weeks in the too recent history. Not fun. Guess I can go first then. I've been working on updating the um, contributing slash hacking docs to um, with the goal of actually being able to have a functional development environment at the end of it. Right now, I think it still reads Python 2, which, yeah. So that gives you an idea of how dated it is. Um, but I'm nearly finished with that. I think I've got one section to finish up with the draft, and then I'll post that in the documentation channel to get some feedback on it and stuff before we actually. I may just open a PR for that as well, even though or I guess a draft PR on it. That's probably the best approach. Um, but because I suspect there's some pieces that I just haven't noticed that will need some updating it as well. Plus the yeah, any updates to the documentation itself, or the
And
document I wrote itself. But yeah, I'm fingers crossed, hoping to get that in today.
that's very cool. All right. Derek, have you been working on anything related to open?
Uh, I don't think so. um, I think I noticed some things when it came to some links that needed updating, and I need to talk to Bryce about what was going on where he had to put a fix in for Sphinx that was either related to Python 3.7 or 3.8, where he was saying something. It was saying something about how the RST files during builds were actually being modified, or something like that. It's kind of weird, and so I wanted to see what was up with that fix to see if that would affect that same problem could potentially affect our other projects. And because then it makes it weird, because I noticed it once when I was trying to contribute to Salt Open, is like I did a build to preview, and then it showed like I have a specialized Git bash prompt, and then it just showed a ton of files that now suddenly were changed, and not in the build directory. The build directory is like ignored by default, but it showed a bunch were modified, and it was so doing a git commit prompt was kind of useless to find what files I just made my changes in, especially if I'm automating changes, like using the link tools to update links. It then threw in just a whole bunch of other RST files. So I need to kind of see if that was the issue Bryce was running into, because it was really weird. Because I mean, I had to do things like kind of create a new branch, and I don't know. So, but it's been a little bit. I probably did a little test last week because someone was pointing out one redirect, uh, and I think a really easy win would be simply modifying and then testing all HTTP to HTTPS modifications, because a lot of the redirects are HTTP to HTTPS, and sometimes the HTTP links don't even have a redirect, but their HTTPS equivalent actually exists. So, other than that, I guess playing around, zero PRs, and I don't think I've commented or added any new issues either.
It's okay. We've been pretty slammed over here, so and I can neither confirm nor deny that I was working until midnight last night. So anyway, Imran, have you been able to do any work related to documentation lately, or anything you'd like to bring up in the meeting today?
To be honest, I was just here as a listener, just to see what's going on, because I take an interest in the documentation. So other than, just uh, doing some documentation stuff on the salt stack formulas side, we've got our own ideas, got a few things we got cooking over there. But no, nothing specific to this.
That's totally fine. So I find that my role with when it comes to the open salt docs is I tend to take on a role of being more of an advocate and getting the right alliances politically in place for SaltStack to help smooth over the process for open docs. To that point, I've been working on a template also for a different open source project, for the Good Docs project, to create a style guide for open source projects. Once that template is in a good place, I'm hoping to port it over here to OpenSalt and collaborate with various individuals who are stakeholders at SaltStack, but also the community to get a better style guide, to provide more guidance when contributing documentation to any of SALT's projects. So that's something I'm kind of working on the side. Some things that I'm going to, the other things that I'm laying the groundwork for right now are, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying I'm not committing to making any big changes either way, because I know changes scare people sometimes, but possibly making some significant revisions to the docs landing page. And I'm talking about like 6 months out. Just to make it a better experience for users and make it more navigable. So one of the things that I'm hoping to maybe get into a good place is to get our search functionality for our documentation working better, and kind of doing the research to figure out how to make that experience of navigating the docs primarily through search, but also maybe through tree navigation and stuff like that, just a better experience. So that's something I'm beginning to think about and laying the groundwork for. I would say the next thing that I might hope for for open docs is to improve the experience of contributing to the docs in general. About a month ago, I needed to make just 2 very simple changes to the docs, and it was very difficult to make just these 2 simple changes to the docs. And like I was changing 2 links and adding 2 paragraphs to 2 topics, and it took me 2 days to do that. That's kind of painful, and I would like to make that better. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping to work on in the next probably next month or so as well. So now I did have a question for Wayne, actually, because I'm just like thinking about things. You know how you have your testing clinic? Can you tell me more about how the testing clinic is run? And the reason why I'm asking is I'm wondering if I loved that idea you made, like maybe last meeting, a couple meetings ago, of how it would be really nice if we could get to the point where if somebody in the community needs to create documentation because they've developed a new module or something like that, if we had a clinic where they could come and just get help writing the documentation. And it sounds like that's kind of similar to what you're doing with the testing clinic. So I would just like to hear more about what you're doing to see if it's in any way scalable for this group or anything like that.
Yeah. Now that you ask that, I think that's a totally great idea, and should definitely work. Timing might be something to consider and work out, but so basically, I do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Tuesday afternoon and Thursday morning Central Time, just because those are 2 times that work for me, and I figure having a morning and afternoon gives the most chance of like global people being able to, actually get some help. So that's what I do, and I do it every week. We may not need to do it every week from a documentation perspective, but that's what I do. And then I just hop on Twitch, and I have, typically there's any number of things I can choose from, right? Especially with like our port forward process. Most of the ones that are left now just don't have any test cases. So there's always like a pool that I can pull from and start writing tests. And so that's what the approach that I've been taking is, obviously I solicit people to come and bring their issues. As a matter of fact, today we had somebody who needed some help, so I was able to help him. But if there's no requests from the community, like, hey, I'm working on this and I need some help writing tests, then I'll just go ahead and pluck from one of the needs test case labels. So from like a documentation perspective, we could totally do that, maybe a couple times a month, where we just say, okay, publish it in the open hour, and really just kind of solicit people who are working on things or whatever. And then of course we've got a number of documentation issues that we want to work on right now. And then so if nothing does come in, then we could just work on those. But typically what I'll do is I'll grab some thing and then I'll just talk through the process of, this is what I'm thinking when I write this. This is what I'm thinking when I write this. So doing that with the documentation. Hey, this is what I'm thinking when I write the documentation or structure it this way, because these are these principles that I'm drawing from. I think if we did that, that would actually be super helpful to the community.
Yeah, and it sounds like it wouldn't be too big of a commit, maybe.
Yeah.
So you just show up basically and say, I'll work through your documents. And so all you've done is you've just dedicated a little bit of time to helping with documentation to anybody who wants to come, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this could be a good model. So so you do it like just a couple times a month? Is that what you do?
So I do it twice a week.
Twice a week. Okay.
Every week.
Sorry.
Yeah, but the test clinic is definitely something that is a heavier lift, right? That's not having tests is a much incorrect documentation is a problem. I think we're all here because we know that bad documentation is bad.
Yeah. And I do 100% agree with you, but it's really interesting you say that, because I mentioned I do this other open source project called the Good Docs project, which is run by a lot of Google people, and they kind of, one of their mottos is kind of, how 10 years ago testing was not a thing, and it wasn't but now it's kind of a baseline requirement for open source projects. They were like, let's see if we can do the same thing for docs, get to the point where people think of having decent docs as like a baseline for a good project or something like that. So
what's super funny is as I was saying that, I was like, that's really not. I mean, it kind of is, but it's also not. I guess you can have a project where you can use the project and it just doesn't have good documentation or any documentation, and it technically still accomplishes its purpose. But documentation, I think the power of documentation is it makes a much broader reach. I just think about projects that I've used in the past, and the ones that have I've either dropped or just simply don't use, or if it was a need that was painful enough and it seemed like I should be able to use this thing, I've gone and dug into the source code to figure out, okay, what the heck is this stuff even doing? And so, I think that's really where the power of good documentation comes from, is, the project may technically work and, incorrect documentation may not necessarily, incorrect or incomplete documentation may not necessarily affect that, but it does affect the number of people who are able to use the project and how easily they're able to use the project.
Absolutely. And it's really important for how quickly people can get up to speed to helping with the project too.
Yeah.
So pretty crucial. But so I wonder, I really don't know how our resources are going to be allocated in the next, everything's going to be in flux for the next like 2 weeks or so. But let's definitely, at least at the next docs working group, let's dig into this. If we don't dig into it before then, let's dig into it and see if there's a way to make this like scalable to like just do a documentation clinic for, because if it's going to be a requirement that you have to have docs if you're submitting a PR or something like that, then it'd be nice if we could like offer some support to help them work through that, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And I really like this idea, and it's something that's kind of been percolating and growing and building. But you know, we have like the test clinic now, and talking about having a doc clinic and stuff. But like, I think that's one of the things that we want to really start pushing as a project. At least that's the way I feel. Is that we really want to start pushing like, hey, we've got all of these different resources to help you be an awesome developer and be able to contribute to the project, and you know, be able to contribute not just meaningfully, but like lower that barrier to entry.
Exactly. That's, you know, what I've been thinking about. Like, we just need to make it so that it's not so hard to contribute, that we're giving you as much support as we can. Yeah. You know? So, yeah.
Exactly. Like my whole thought is that we should be able to and be removing as many barriers to contribution as possible. Like, yeah, we can't give you more time in the day. We can't, you know, babysit your kids. You know, we can't do whatever, but we can make it so you don't need to spend as much time to actually make a contribution. We can make it so that you have all the resources just mentally and training wise, where like you're not just like, how do I do this thing? I don't know. Or what's required? I don't know. But we can actually say, here's the checklist of things that you should be doing. And if you need help with this, go here. If you need help with this, go here. If you need help with tests, go here. If you need help with documentation, go here. And if you know, if reading this doesn't help, then there are people here who can discuss things with you and work it out. You know, just giving people those resources. I think that's what.
And I would think, so if one of the technical writers is going to help with this project, it might be helpful to have a member of the core team kind of shadow us or be with us to mentor us in being able to mentor, if that makes sense. Like, I still feel like I need to need a little bit of help getting up to speed to make sure that I understand how your documentation works, especially with the modules and stuff like that. And so there's going to be a few gaps for me personally in my knowledge that I need to fill in order to get to the point where I can become a mentor. But it sounds really exciting to get to that point. So it would be nice to just talk to somebody with core to see what are the gaps that I need to fill, how can I do it to get to the point where I can be a mentor. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it's a similar thing from my side too, because I definitely want to be able to contribute more and to mentor people too. And a docs clinic sounds like a pretty awesome thing that I think I'd like to be a part of.
Cool. I think I'll go ahead and like post this to the core channel, just that we talked about it today, because I think it's like it'll be a well-received idea, and it'll be something for people to think about, maybe. So yeah, cool. All right. Yeah, I just had that brainstorm when you posted about the testing clinic. I was like, why don't we do documentation clinics? Okay. So yeah, cool.
Just a couple of bits of feedback from my side, listening to
Yeah.
that discussion. Taking the point about the importance of documentation, I'll start with the formulas and I'll go into SALT just very briefly. we've got formulas which are the end point, if you like, of using salt. And even the formulas themselves can become quite complex. So what we've had in the last couple of weeks is that we need to include a usage section in each formula's README, because you could start using a formula, even if you can read the code, and you could be using it in all the wrong ways. And then what happens is when we finally explain to people how to use it properly, they have to readjust all of their usage of that formula, or how they're setting up their pillars or config and all the rest of it. And it takes a lot of time. In fact, right now, myself, because I've learned so many new things over the last year, I'm having to adjust I'm in the process of adjusting how I use formulas. And that's after a year and a half. And I've actually got 5 years of experience with formulas, and I'm still readjusting because of bad documentation at the beginning. Taking salt as an example, the whole concept of pillars, and we've got this on the board in documentation. To this day, there are so many conversations in the Slack channels about people using pillars in the wrong way. Now, if you imagine you've set up hundreds and hundreds of, data entries in your pillars, and now you have to change all of that because pillars is the wrong way to do things, that's bad documentation. And if you look at the documentation today, it still says pillars. So I think documentation is ridiculously important. Okay, so that's one side of things. There was another point, but I'll let you comment first. There was one more point. I just forgot what it was.
Yeah, I don't know how that goes. Eventually it'll come back to you. But yeah, no, I was just thinking, there's a term, the XY problem. And that's, I encountered that a lot in the Python chat and the Stack Overflow, on Stack Overflow. We'd have a lot of people who would come in with an XY problem there, and they're like, oh, I'm trying to solve this problem Y. And you're looking at it and you're like, why in the world would somebody be doing something this way? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, this is just, it feels like somebody doesn't understand something. And then you dig into it, and after like 2 hours of conversation, you find out they're really trying to do X, but they just got so far down the road that they're doing Y instead, and Y really has nothing to do with X. And when you're like, oh, you're trying to solve X, well, really what you need to do is just do a watch requisite and have your service restart. Like, that's all you need to do instead of doing like 75 different other things and just all sorts of weird wonkiness. I think salt definitely lends itself to that problem. I think in part is just like I don't know what you'd call it, like term reuse. We use the same term a lot in different ways because you have modules and you have state modules and you have states and you have pillars and you have top files and their top files in the pillars and you have top files in your states, and it kind of, and then you have custom modules and things carry on. So it's not, and I remember this very, very distinctly from when I first started Salt. Like, it's not easy to understand all those terms and the way that we use them in Salt. And, it's really just difficult to wrap your head around those different principles as a newcomer to Salt. And I think if you're just trying to like get your ops work done and you come in and you're just like, I'm just trying to get home today, and you come across Salt and you're like, oh, okay, cool, this will help me get home today. And you do something and you're like, oh, okay, cool, I got it to work. And like, you got it to work by writing 50 pillars that, it's like, oh, you probably shouldn't have done that with pillars, but like, they don't know any better because we don't have documentation that really like lays that out. And I guess to that point, one of the things that Gareth brings up pretty regularly is just one of the things that we really need, kind of echoing your call there, Imran, is that like, we've got a number of things where it's like, how do I even use this module? How do I even use this state? Like, I don't know. We just don't have the documentation saying, okay, if you want to set up a Nginx reverse proxy with PHP behind it, or with a Python service behind it. Like, this is what you would do to do that. And just give those, like, I want to do X, how do I do that correctly? And just the documentation there. And I know it's like it's a huge task, right? That's not just saying, okay, go fix a typo. Like, there's a number of things that go into that. So I think figuring out how to tackle that elephant, eat that elephant, I think is something that will pay off dividends as we figure that out.
One thing that you said that makes me think that we could really benefit from is just one kind of place where we have a word list that defines all our terms and how you should use them and how you shouldn't use them. Like just and some examples of how they're used, or and in context. Like just something where we just have some key terms and terminology, or does this exist and I'm just not aware of it?
I suspect parts of it exist, but
Yeah.
I'm almost 100% certain that it does not exist in the form that you just mentioned, where it's like, here, because I know we've got things defined like masters and minions and pillars and things, but it's just.
But there's more than that.
Yeah, there's more than that, and having like that specifically, using it in context, like I think that's key.
Yeah, exactly.
Say, using the Alice and Bob, right? Mm-hmm. Alice says, hey, I need to do this, and Bob goes off and sets up whatever, and he, I think if we had something to that effect, that would be massively useful for the community.
Yeah, and something that's maintained too, where you can like look at different uses of that particular term in the documentation, or just in general discussions about SALT and something like that, just to kind of see how the term is being used and what it really means and what people mean when they use that term.
Yeah.
So.
Because to that effect, I mean, language is important, right? Like, language is how we communicate, and we build up these abstractions in our head over time using SALT. And I think sometimes they're incorrect abstractions that we've built up, and by having better examples so that people can really build up those correct abstractions.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, I was, working for SALT for a while before I even realized like that there's this whole event bus thing that happens, and like really dug down into that piece. So there's definitely a lot of bits in SALT.
Oh, and it's so funny, like even just the event bus. The other day I was like, wait, okay, are the event bus and the message bus the same thing? Because I thought they were two different things for a long time.
Yeah.
They're the same thing. And then I was like, okay, well, which one do we use to really refer to it? And the answer was, of course, the event bus. But I spent like an hour tracking that piece down recently.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And that's part of the thing too, is like in industry, event bus and communication bus and message bus, they're all kind of a similar, they're all synonyms. And if you're not deeply entrenched in, and heck for that, it's like in computer science, because most people don't really even talk about event buses and communication buses, despite the fact that they use them all the time. They just do without even realizing it. And so but that's just, it's a very specific concept. And if you're not aware of the concept, and you're not familiar with the fact that there are a few different synonyms for it, like in your case, you build up these ideas in your mind, and then you've got to address them and fix them once you understand oh, these are the same thing. Okay, cool.
Well, and at the bare minimum, I feel like SaltStack itself should be consistent in the way it uses its terms. So, you know,
Yeah.
so just at least be consistent with ourselves. So that could be good. Anyway, but yeah, well, and I like this project idea, like this wordless project idea, because it's actually something I could do. Sometimes certain open salt stuff feels like, oh, I just need to know more about salt before I can contribute to that. But
Yeah.
terminology and tracking the way terms are used in our documentation and in the community, that's something achievable that I can do. So maybe that's something I could take on.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Anyway.
And I'm, of course, more than happy to consult technically on it. And make
Yes, please.
sure if we come across something and we're like, are these synonyms or are they?
Yeah, exactly. Well, like the event bus and the message bus thing the other day. Yeah. Imran, did you happen to remember your other point?
Yeah, it actually overlaps with this whole conversation anyway. It was actually what you mentioned earlier about saying it took you 2 days to make that contribution. First question, was that because you didn't know where to look for the input, like where to actually make the changes, or was it because, what was the reason behind that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about it. So what happened with that was, so we had our CVE release recently, and as part of that, we wanted to make some documentation changes so that we could provide better feedback about not exposing your masters publicly to the internet. Because some people had gotten the false impression from our documentation that we were recommending that when that's not a good thing to recommend. So we wanted to make sure we were clearing all of that up. So that was the purpose of my fixes, was to make sure that that was clear in our communication. So basically somebody else even wrote out what they wanted me to change. And I needed to change 2 things. And because I needed to link between them, that's what made it complicated, because as a good technical writer, I don't want to push broken links to our documentation. In order to make sure I'm not pushing broken links to our documentation, I need to build a local preview and check the links locally to make sure that it's good. That's where things got really hairy, because when I created the first request where I was only editing 1 topic with no links, everything went fine with the merge request. But once I needed to build a local preview, things got really hard. Like I had to talk to, I don't know, I talked to maybe 3 different people on Core to talk about how do you build a local environment to just test the links in the docs. And I got 3 different answers, and none of them actually worked. I had to talk to Derek about it and say, can you help me? And yeah, so I finally got the local preview working, but when the local preview, so I had to create a virtual environment in order to get the local preview to work. Creating that local environment suddenly messed up everything in the push that I was going to make to the commit. I don't know why, but it like pulled in all of this stuff that I did not want. And I didn't tell it to commit that. And that has happened to me multiple times when contributing to Salt in the past, where it pulls in all this stuff and I do not know why, because I didn't add it to the commit. So what's going on? And then DWAS will get all mad at me and be like, why are you pulling all this stuff into the commit? This is bad.
Yeah.
And then there's the GPG signing thing, which is hard because that was hard for me. But go ahead, Imran.
No, this is feeding into exactly what I was about to discuss. And I think it got mentioned before, but wasn't the idea about splitting out the documentation into a separate repo? What happened to that idea in the end?
We are going to do that. It's just been difficult to get the pieces in place for that to happen. But that is something that because you're right, like just separating that out would probably solve a lot of those problems. Now, and I apologize because I don't use these terms correctly, but so if I understand, we need to have like the core documentation that's just like the concepts and the tutorials and things like that. The idea is that we're going to separate that and put it into a different repo. And that's going to have less of a barrier to entry to contribute in theory, right? Like you don't, like it'll be easier to build a local preview of that. Sure. It'll be easier to, we probably won't require a signing key, I would imagine, to contribute to the documentation, maybe, I don't know. but so that would be easier to contribute to that. And then we would still keep stuff like the the docstring type documentation for modules and state I use these terms incorrectly, so I apologize. Those things that need to stay, where that documentation needs to stay in the project, will stay in the project, right?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Also, just a quick side note, building a local preview of the documentation is part of what's in my contributing work. So apparently I missed it by that much.
Oh man. Yeah. So, but it was also a while ago, and you were not one of the people I talked to, and I should have talked to you. So
I was gonna say, and you'll be a perfect guinea pig to
yes.
this documentation stuff, because you could be like, oh yeah, cool, I was able to follow these steps and build the documentation, and it wasn't hard, and I wasn't frustrated. And
And it's tricky because well, it was weird because these are tools that I use every day, and it was really hard to do it in Salt for some reason. So yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I guess back to the other point about where things will live. Assuming that I'm also understanding things correctly, the bulk of the documentation, concepts, higher order stuff will live in the documentation repo, and that can be built, I guess, technically quasi-independently from Salt, because
Right.
one of the ways that the documentation is built is it does include all of the Salt modules and stuff, and says, okay, I need to get that information from over here. So we would still have to have that available and linked together somehow, but you have two repos and put them somewhere, and it should be relatively straightforward to, as long as they're like relative to each other.
It should be doable. I mean, Derek can speak better to this than I can, but we do that with our enterprise docs, where we have the core documentation and then we have the API documentation in a separate repo, and we've set it up to coordinate between the two of those. So it should be feasible, right? Is that fair, Derek?
Yeah, because the end goal would be, so we have a lot of things in GitLab now, and that's been a part of things too, because Salt itself is staying in GitHub. But if we split out the documentation, we may split out the documentation to have that exist inside of GitLab, where we would then make use of GitLab CI. And then potentially then there are interesting ways that you can use GitLab pages as part of the CI pipeline, so that if you were wanting to test it yourself, instead of having to create like a bunch of stuff locally to kind of test and mess around with things, you'd be able to kind of just make your change to the documentation. The pipeline would pull in all the doc strings to generate the documentation out of the Salt code automatically in your preview, and along with whatever changes and modifications you're making to the standalone docs, so that you could easily view it, and you can commit a whole bunch of times if you needed to, because GitLab also makes it really simplified to do squashed commit, like, hey, squash all these commits as part of this merge, so that if you kind of mess around quite a bit for that preview to properly work, it shouldn't be too difficult. But also then we might be able to, I mean, if we're technically using a lot of these lines of code inside of GitLab CI, that could be part of documentation for if we're like, hey, do you want to do this locally in your own dev environment? But the interesting thing that would end up as, though, is that if you wouldn't be able to do certain things in tandem, in the sense that if you had to make a modification to doc strings along with an accompanying standalone doc, you'd have to then do a PR to both repos. So like, I don't know, if there was a module in particular that had, if you're making a change in the RST docs, but then also you want to reflect some of that information in the module, the doc strings too, you'd have to just make sure to contribute to both repositories, as opposed to like one single PR. But yeah, I think that would be the end goal. I don't know how that sounds, but that's kind of like what we do right now for the enterprise ones, is that we're able to make changes to the base enterprise docs documentation, and its GitLab CI pipeline goes to that repository to build those API docs and doc strings. To that, then have them embedded in, kind of like we do in Salt Open. So I don't know how that sounds to people, or how that may ultimately, hopefully, improve the barrier to entry.
Yeah, how does that sound, Imran? What's your initial reaction to that?
Yeah, no, that's the idea. But taking it a bit further to the culmination of what I'm saying is, what you really want to tap into, I believe, is the people who are, long-term users of Salt to come through to the documentation and just rapidly develop the documentation around different topics of Salt. Obviously, having someone who's reviewing that, but just really encouraging them to share their knowledge of the different parts of what pillars are, how to use them, how they fit in with whichever other areas of Salt. For example, when I'm working, I've been doing development for so long now, and my best times have been when I've documented what I've been doing at the same time, just for my own personal use. Because 5 years down the line, it's a cliche, but 5 years down the line, you'll look back at your code, you'll be like, what have I done? What did I do at that time? And I just go back to my documentation of that time, and I get it like within minutes, rather than hours of trawling through my code and figuring out what was I doing at that time. So what you really want to do is people write the best documentation at that moment of when they've used it. And if that's going straight into the actual documentation for Salt as well, and so someone uses something and like, right, I know a different angle on the docs that needs to be fixed, let me propose this right now. You want to encourage that. You want to get as many people as possible participating to improve the docs continuously. So splitting it out and getting that encouragement and getting like you said, all these GitLab pipelines to bring all the bits in, you just want to encourage that as much as possible, I believe.
Well, I wonder too, because I think the big feedback that we get whenever we talk to the community is they just want more use cases and scenarios, kind of going back to what you were saying, Wayne, about like, I have this use case, I want to see how to build it out in this particular environment or something like that. It could be nice if somebody was kind of managing it to kind of say, hey, we need to build out some examples for X, throw your ideas at us, and then have somebody maybe somebody from core to just review them and say, no, that's a bad idea. Yeah, that's a good idea. That kind of thing. Just to get some more use cases out there, kind of like a cookbook of what you do with Salt and stuff like that. But yeah.
That makes me think of, so I haven't been to SaltConf, but does SaltConf have almost like a docs workshop or like hackathon type thing? Or have there been docs like kind of like hackathon type contribution days? Or because I know that it could be an interesting community thing, kind of like Imran said, is that there could be a lot of people who have a lot more experience with it. Like, for example, someone who uses the Kubernetes Slack module or something, who actually goes, oh yeah, there are all sorts of things I could come up with when it comes to examples or things maybe missing in the docs that I've had to just figure out on my own. Kind of like subject matter experts based on the target technologies. I don't know. Has that been something that Salt has done before?
Sort of, but we didn't implement it effectively. I'll just say it ineffectively. Like, my actual first experience with Salt before I was an employee was going to one of the open docs working group meetings that was held around SaltConf and contributing, and that was interesting. That was an interesting experience. But I think that was our first experiment with it, and I think we could make it even better. In the last session, all we did was just had people who are interested in the documentation get together and discuss ideas, kind of like we're doing now. So we didn't really do any actual work, but I would love to like talk to whoever's in charge of SaltConf and see, like, my ideal would be if we had, you know how Write the Docs conference has a writing day, and it's the day before the actual conference begins. Wouldn't it be just so awesome to have like an open day where you can get and the working groups can meet for the whole day and just sit at a table and get work done, and same thing with documentation where we can put out a call and say, hey, we need a use case scenario for these kind of things. This is what users need some more examples of. And experienced users can just say, yeah, I'll contribute. I'll tell you what what works for me and how I got it to work, that kind of thing. I would
I-
love to have something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be excellent to advocate for. Would be like a pre-con day that's a work group's kind of like dedicated day, which would then include the docs. That'd be really cool. Because then for instance, we'd be meeting also virtually or physically, I guess, people who in the community, people who maybe haven't even attended any of the work group meetings, but because it's a pre-con day, would be something maybe, hey, kind of cool to join in on. And no, I think that'd be cool. At a minimum, at least, to have that one day a year, if not potentially develop something. I don't know, some other kind of workshop too. But that sounds really cool. I'd be on board with advocating for that too. I don't know.
Totally.
I don't know, Wayne, how that sounds for you. Like if you're thinking of that when it comes to like test clinic, when it comes to like other work groups, if you're like, oh man, if we had a pre-con day, I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, and we've actually talked about doing this, and we were in the process of doing one for doing all the merging, doing all these ports to master of all these other things, and so we were just going to have a big port party, code jam, whatever you want to call it, sprint, and just have like a little kickoff meeting, and then everybody just grabs all the PRs and then runs with it. And we did that internally, and it actually worked rather well. We got, I want to say, there's over 100 PRs ported to master. Many of them still need tests, so there's that. But like merge conflicts was kind of one of the big things that happened, so we had to resolve all those and whatnot. But yeah, so we've done that in the past, and we've done some things in the past, like even before I was here, we had done stuff, and that's something that I definitely want to get moving again and rolling and happening regularly, whether that's like once a year, once a quarter, whatever, where we have these times, whether it's a doc sprint or a code sprint or both or all of the above, just some type of regular occurrence where we can bring everybody together and folks can contribute and stuff, and just have a good time, whether that's virtually or physically.
Yeah. I don't know what's going to happen this year.
Yeah.
And plus, we've had a lot of personnel changes inside SaltStack, and I don't know how that's going to affect SaltConf this year. So we'll see. Pandemic and personnel changes, we'll just have to see how those play out, I guess. But I think it'd be awesome if we could do something like that. Well, we're starting to get towards time. This has been a fun conversation, believe it or not. I've enjoyed it. So it's been good talking to all of you. So I'll maybe write up a summary of some of the things we discussed. Maybe to be safe, I'll post it on the Open Docs channel, since that's less, I guess, less political than posting to core or something like that. And I'll probably post some notes to our community documentation channel too, just to put out some ideas. So, all right. Anything anybody else wants to say? Okay.
Not that I can think of right now.
Cool. Yay, Open Docs. All right. See you later.
Bye bye.